The notification that appeared on Marcus Chun's phone at 11:47 p.m. showed a figure standing at his front door, and when he opened the live feed to investigate, he watched in real time as a hand reached toward the doorknob and began turning it slowly, testing the lock with patient determination, while his wife, Jessica, sat beside him on the couch not 15 feet from that same door, both of them frozen in the blue glow of his phone screen, watching something that should have been impossible. Because when Marcus looked up from the footage to stare at the front door, he could see through the frosted glass panel that no one was standing there, the porch light illuminating empty space, where the camera insisted a figure was still trying to gain entry. Jessica saw it too, her hand gripping his arm with enough force to leave bruises that would not fade for weeks. The figure on the screen was humanoid, but wrong in proportions that became more disturbing the longer they looked. Arms slightly too long, head tilted at an angle that suggested a neck with too many vertebrae, fingers that wrapped around the doorknob in a way that implied extra joints, bending where human anatomy provided none. The doorbell camera's night vision rendered everything in that sickly green-gray palette that made even innocent visitors look sinister. But this was not an innocent visitor, and the color palette was not responsible for the wrongness that radiated from every pixel of the image. Marcus stood up slowly, his phone still in his hand, his eyes alternating between the screen and the door in a rhythm that made his head spin with cognitive dissonance. The figure on camera continued working the doorknob, methodically testing different rotational pressures, learning the mechanism with an intelligence that was evident in every micro-adjustment of those two long fingers. But the physical doorknob in his living room remained stationary, the deadbolt engaged, the chain lock secure, no movement whatsoever to correspond with what the camera was documenting in real time, with a timestamp that updated every second. Their daughter Emily was sleeping upstairs, 8 years old, and blissfully unaware of what was happening on the ground floor of the home her parents had promised would always keep her safe. Marcus thought of her immediately when the figure on screen turned its head toward the camera as if sensing his observation, its face a blur that the high-definition equipment should not have produced, features smeared like a watercolor painting left in the rain. The motion detection had triggered the recording. The live feed was active and streaming, and yet the entity on screen existed only in the digital realm, present in the camera's perception while remaining invisible to the naked eye. Jessica whispered that they should call the police, her voice barely audible, despite the silence that had descended over their home like a physical weight. Marcus nodded but found himself unable to look away from his phone, hypnotized by the figure that had stopped testing the door and now stood facing the camera directly, its posture suggesting patience rather than frustration, as if it had known all along that the physical lock was irrelevant to its purposes. The timestamp continued advancing. The recording continued capturing. And somewhere between the lens of the camera and the screen of his phone, something was happening that neither of them could explain. The doorbell rang at 11:52, the chime echoing through the house with a cheerfulness that felt obscene given the circumstances. Marcus jumped backward, his phone flying from his hand and clattering across the hardwood floor, while Jessica screamed in a register that brought their daughter's sleepy voice calling from upstairs, asking what was wrong, asking why Mommy was scared. The figure on the dropped phone screen had pressed the doorbell button, and both the digital and physical worlds had responded simultaneously. the first synchronization between the reality the camera recorded and the reality the family inhabited. Marcus retrieved his phone with hands that shook so violently he nearly dropped it again, his eyes confirming what the small speaker in his doorbell had already announced. The figure had moved closer, its blurred face now filling most of the frame, its hand still extended from pressing the button, its head tilted as if listening for a response from within. He looked at the door and saw nothing through the frosted glass, no shadow, no shape, no indication that anything stood on the porch that connected to that cheerful electronic chime. But he could feel something now, a presence that pressed against the barrier between them, testing it as methodically as those fingers had tested the lock. Jessica was on the phone with 911, her voice strained as she tried to explain a situation that resisted coherent description. "Someone at their door," she said. "On the camera, but not visible, trying to get in." The dispatcher asked clarifying questions that Jessica could not answer because there were no clarifications available, no logical framework into which this experience could be fitted. Marcus heard her frustration building as she repeated herself, as she insisted she was not hallucinating, as she begged for officers to come quickly, while knowing that whatever response arrived would likely come too late to matter. Emily appeared at the top of the stairs in her unicorn pajamas, her stuffed rabbit dangling from one hand, her face displaying the confused fear of a child who had learned to trust her parents' protection, and was now witnessing that protection fail. Marcus wanted to tell her everything was fine, wanted to manufacture the reassurance that fathers were supposed to provide in moments of crisis, but the words died in his throat when his phone buzzed with a new notification. Motion detected at back door, the alert read, and when he switched cameras, he saw another figure, identical to the first, testing the handle of their kitchen entrance with the same patient methodology. The back door figure turned its blurred face toward that camera as well, creating a symmetry of observation that suggested coordination, intelligence, planning. These were not random intruders or glitching cameras or tricks of light and shadow. These were entities that knew they were being watched and wanted the watching to continue, wanted the family inside to understand that barriers were temporary and surveillance was a two-way phenomenon. Marcus had installed these cameras for security, for peace of mind, for the comfort of knowing he could monitor his home from anywhere in the world. Jessica ended her call with 911. Officers dispatched but 20 minutes away in a county where budget cuts had reduced police presence to skeletal coverage. 20 minutes was an eternity when measured against the methodical patience of the figures at their doors, when measured against the growing certainty that whatever was testing their entrances was learning, adapting, discovering the weaknesses that every barrier eventually revealed. She gathered Emily into her arms and looked at Marcus with an expression that contained question and accusation and desperate hope, all tangled together into something that broke his heart. The power went out at 11:58. Plunging the house into darkness so complete that Marcus understood immediately this was not a normal outage. The street lights remained on outside, visible through windows that now seemed like fragile membrane between safety and something else. The neighbor's porch light continued burning across the street. Only their house had been selected for this particular darkness, as if the electricity itself had been cut by hands that understood exactly which wires to sever. His phone still functioned on battery power, the screen still displaying the camera feeds that continued recording despite the building's blackout. The figures had not moved during the power failure, both of them maintaining their positions at front and back doors with a stillness that seemed to deepen in the absence of ambient light. But Marcus noticed something new in the footage, something that made his stomach clench with a nausea that had nothing to do with physical illness. The cameras were equipped with night vision that activated automatically in darkness, revealing details that normal lighting had obscured, and in that enhanced visibility he could finally see the faces of the figures clearly, faces that had been blurred only moments before, but now resolved into features he recognized with a horror that transcended anything he had felt before. The figure at the front door wore his face. The figure at the back door wore Jessica's. The features were distorted, stretched over skulls that were not shaped correctly for human physiology, but the resemblance was unmistakable, the eyes and nose and mouth arranged in configurations that mirrored the family they were stalking with perfect accuracy. These things had studied them, had copied them, had created masks from their identities that now pressed against the barriers of their home-seeking admission. Marcus looked at his wife and saw her looking at the screen, saw her hand rise to her own face as if confirming she was still herself, saw the tears begin streaming down cheeks that someone else was wearing on the other side of their kitchen door. Emily began crying, sensing the terror her parents could not hide, despite their attempts to maintain composure for her sake. The sound of her distress echoed through the dark house, and was answered by something that made all three of them freeze in place. A knock came from upstairs from the window of Emily's bedroom, a rhythmic tapping that matched the pattern Marcus always used when checking on his daughter after nightmares. Tap, 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 tap. The special knock that meant Daddy was here and everything was safe. Someone or something had learned that pattern and was now using it to draw the child toward a window that opened onto the roof outside. Marcus grabbed Emily and pulled her close, positioning himself between his daughter and the stairs while Jessica flanked them both, the family forming a protective cluster in the center of their living room while the sounds multiplied around them, knocking at the upstairs window, testing at the front door, testing at the back door, and now, emerging from his phone's speaker, a sound that the cameras had begun recording and transmitting, a voice speaking in syllables that almost formed words, language that was being learned in real time by things that had never needed to communicate before. The voice from the front door camera said his name, not clearly, not quite correctly, but close enough that there was no mistaking the intent. Marcus, it called. The syllables stretched and distorted like a recording played at wrong speed. Marcus, come see. The voice from the back door camera echoed with Jessica's name, the same elongated pronunciation, the same invitation that was also a command. And from upstairs, from whatever had learned his special knock, came Emily's name in a whisper that should not have been audible through closed windows and locked doors, but somehow reached them anyway. Jessica spotted the car keys on the kitchen counter, visible in the dim light filtering through windows, and Marcus understood her plan without words being exchanged. The garage was attached, the car inside, the automatic door opener battery operated, and therefore unaffected by the power outage. If they could reach the car, they could escape, could drive until the sun rose and the things on their cameras disappeared or followed or revealed the full extent of their capabilities. It was not a good plan, but it was the only plan available, and hesitation would only give their observers more time to learn, more time to adapt, more time to find the weakness that all barriers eventually exposed. They moved together toward the garage door, Marcus carrying Emily while Jessica led the way with a flashlight from the emergency kit they kept in the hall closet. The beam cut through darkness that seemed to resist illumination, shadows pooling in corners with unusual density, the familiar geometry of their home suddenly alien and threatening. The cameras continued recording, the feeds still streaming to the phone in Marcus's pocket, documenting their movement through the house from the perspective of entities that watched with interest bordering on fascination. The garage door opened onto a space that should have contained only their 2 cars and the accumulated possessions of suburban existence. But when Jessica's flashlight swept across the concrete floor, it revealed footprints that had not been there when Marcus parked that evening, prints that matched no shoes he recognized, tracks that seemed to lead from the walls themselves, emerging from solid concrete as if the barriers of the house had already been breached in ways that the cameras had not documented. Something had been inside with them, had walked through their garage while they lived their evening in ignorance, had left traces of its passage like a signature announcing its presence. The car refused to start when Marcus turned the key, the engine making no sound whatsoever, despite the battery having been replaced just 3 months earlier. The dashboard remained dark. The door locks would not engage. The vehicle sat in the garage like a dead thing, no more useful for escape than the walls that surrounded them. And through the small window in the garage door, Marcus saw what the flashlight could not reach: figures standing in the driveway, 3 of them now instead of 2, each wearing a face borrowed from the family trapped inside. They retreated back into the house, back through the darkness that pressed closer with each passing moment, back to the living room where they had first noticed the notification that had started this nightmare. The figures on the cameras had not moved during their attempted escape, maintaining their positions at the doors with patience that no longer seemed natural but mechanical, programmed following protocols that human panic could not disrupt. And the third figure, the new one, appeared on the driveway camera wearing Emily's face stretched over a frame that was far too large to belong to any child. The police arrived at 12:17, their lights visible through windows that Marcus no longer trusted, their presence announced by the cameras that showed them approaching a house whose doors now stood open, despite no one inside having unlocked them. The officers entered cautiously, flashlights sweeping through rooms that the family had fled what felt like hours ago, but the timestamps revealed was only minutes. The cameras recorded everything: the confusion on official faces, the radio calls requesting backup, the moment when one officer looked directly at the camera and asked if anyone was watching, if anyone could explain what they had found inside. Marcus and Jessica and Emily were never found inside the house or anywhere else, their disappearance treated as a missing persons case that remained open but inactive. No leads, no evidence, no explanation for a family that had simply ceased to exist between the hours of midnight and morning. Their doorbell camera and the other devices continued recording for 17 days until the power company shut off service for non-payment, documenting an empty house that was never quite as empty as it should have been. The footage from those 17 days was analyzed by investigators who released statements describing equipment malfunction and video artifacts. But the unedited recordings leaked by someone within the department who felt the public deserved the truth showed something entirely different. They showed the figures continuing to visit each night, approaching the doors they had finally been permitted to open, entering a house they had claimed, moving through rooms with familiarity that increased over time. They showed the figures learning to turn on lights and open refrigerators and operate electronics with hands that grew more human-shaped with each passing night. The final recording before the power was disconnected showed all three figures sitting on the living room couch, positioned exactly where the family had been seated when the nightmare began. They faced the television, which displayed the live feed from the doorbell camera, watching the screen with attention that suggested understanding. And as the recording ended, as the time stop froze on its final moment, the figure wearing Marcus's face turned to look directly into the camera with eyes that had learned to focus properly, with features that had settled into perfect replication, with an expression that might have been satisfaction or might have been anticipation for whatever came next. The house on Maple Street remains vacant to this day, its listing permanently stalled by disclosures that frighten away potential buyers despite the competitive pricing. The doorbell camera system remains installed, the devices still visible from the street, the lens still pointed at a porch where new visitors occasionally stand without knowing the history of the ground beneath their feet. Neighbors report motion-activated lights flickering on at odd hours, report notification sounds from devices that should not still be functional, report the uneasy feeling of being watched that never quite disappears no matter how many curtains are drawn. The family who moved in 3 houses down installed their own camera system after the Maple Street incident, convinced that surveillance was the key to safety in an increasingly dangerous world. They checked their feeds religiously, watching for intruders, watching for threats, watching without understanding that watching is an invitation. Their doorbell camera records every visitor, every delivery, every neighbor walking past on evening strolls. And sometimes, late at night, it records something else, a figure standing at the edge of the frame, just barely visible, watching them watch their screens, learning their faces and their routines and their special knocks. The recordings continue. The watchers are always watching, and somewhere between the camera lens and the phone screen, in that digital space where reality becomes data, becomes image, becomes nothing at all, something is waiting to be seen by eyes that do not understand what seeing truly costs.